On Black News Tonight, tensions are high in Minneapolis. Residents there upset that crews are cleaning up what's now known as George Floyd Square. Media mogul BYRON Allen is once again taking on a big corporation. He's suing McDonald's for $10 billion, alleging racial discrimination and advertisement practices. I'll talk to the man himself about the case and the bigger picture around economic inclusion for Black America. The tide seems to be turning for the reparations bill, H.R. 40, as it's coming to the House floor. While many Black Americans support the idea, some stand firmly against it. I'll talk to Coleman Hughes, a leading Black voice opposing reparations. Singer and actress KANDI BURRUSS joins me. We'll be talking about season 4 of The Chi, her business Candy Coated Ink, and Pride Month. Black News Tonight starts now. Good evening, I'm Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to Black News Tonight. This evening, residents and community activists in Minneapolis showed their frustration as the city began the process to reopen the intersection where George Floyd was murdered last year. Chicago Avenue and 38th Street has become a symbol recognizable across the nation. It's more commonly known as George Floyd Square. Crews began taking down barricades that prevented vehicles from driving on the road. Now, some activists don't want the intersection to reopen. They're hoping it'll help keep a remembrance of George Floyd. Many accuse the city's political leadership of ignoring demands for change. Activists have vowed not to relinquish the surrounding streets until a number of demands are met. That includes reopening investigations into other local Black men who were killed by police. This is an important point here. The idea that Derek Chauvin's conviction means that we have reached a level of success where we can go back to normal is something different. It's something improper. No, we have to keep fighting, keep organizing, keep building. At the moment where things seem easy and comfortable, we have to disrupt again. And what better way to disrupt than right there at George Floyd Square? Now, it shouldn't be only there, but we got to keep fighting. Meanwhile, Minnesota prosecutors are recommending that Derek Chauvin, the officer convicted of Floyd's murder, spends 30 years in prison. The sentence is actually twice what Minnesota guidelines suggest. But Chauvin's defense team is asking that he receive probation and time served, or at the very least, a lesser sentence than what the law suggests. Chauvin was convicted in April of second-degree murder, second-degree unintentional murder, second-degree manslaughter as well, and of course, third-degree murder in the death of Floyd. He's set to be sentenced on June 25th. If you haven't heard of the recent move by BYRON Allen, let's just say he is coming hard against racial discrimination, and he's definitely doing it for the culture. We told you about his recently filed lawsuit against McDonald's. He's suing the food chain for $10 billion, alleging racial discrimination because the company refuses to advertise with his networks. Entertainment Studios and Weather Group are those networks that we're referring to, and Allen claims that most of McDonald's advertising budget is allocated to the, quote, general market, and that a different company with a much smaller budget is set aside for Black companies, excluding them from the proverbial bigger piece of the pie. In a recent statement, Allen said, and I quote, "The biggest trade deficit in America is the trade deficit between white corporate America and Black America, and McDonald's is guilty of perpetuating this disparity. The economic exclusion must stop immediately." Now, BYRON Allen is no stranger to taking on big corporations. In 2015, Allen sued Comcast for $20 billion for refusing to carry 7 of his networks, saying it was because of his race. Comcast settled, agreeing to add 3 of Allen's channels to its cable packages. He also settled a similar dispute with Charter. He's a bad boy. And he joins me right now to talk about not only his fight for equality, but also some of the new ventures that he's working on. BYRON, good to see you.
Good to see you. You're doing a great job. It's really good to see you.
Thank you, BYRON. Now, you are, of course, as we said, no stranger to taking on big corporations. You sued Comcast for $20 billion in 2015 for refusing to carry 7 of your networks, and they settled. And the question or the issue first that I want to point out is you didn't just sue for yourself. You didn't just sue so you could get your channels on a network. There was a bigger project at play. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, Coretta Scott King was a friend of mine, and she taught me quite a bit. And she said to me, Byron, because I really wanted to get to know her and get to understand Martin Luther King through her eyes. And she said, listen, Byron, as Black people, we had four major challenges in this country. Number one, end slavery. Number two, end Jim Crow. Number three, achieve civil rights. And then she choked up and she said, and number four, the real reason they killed my Martin, achieve economic inclusion. She said, you know, Byron, they didn't kill Martin over the speech, I Have a Dream. They killed my Martin over this speech he gave at Stanford University, The Other America. In that speech, he talked about there being two Americas, and one America having access to an education and economic inclusion, and the other America does not. And two Americas will not survive. And that was it. You know, that changed my life forever. And I realized, you know, this was never about Black, and this was never about white. This has always been about green. And that's the reason they even created slavery. That's the reason they brought us here, was to create this unbelievable economic platform known as America, Inc. And so we have to close that trade deficit. And ever since we have been emancipated, that genocide kicked in because they didn't want to share the great American economic pie with us. And if you look at the very first Civil Rights Act in America, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Section 1981, that Civil Rights Act right there, what it says is that the newly freed slaves, African Americans, are to have economic inclusion in government contracting and commercial contracting. And here we are 155 years later, and that has not been achieved. So I told Coretta that, you know, she and her generation have done more than enough, and that I and this generation, we would handle the fourth and final chapter, economic inclusion. And she said, yes. She said, she was very sweet. She said to me, you know, you're smart enough to get it done, but just remember, they will come after you, because that's what it's always been about, economic inclusion. And they've worked very hard to exclude us. So I thought about the matrix that we live in as Black people. I thought about how this has occurred for centuries and decades after decades. And I said, it's those 4 Ds that they put on us that you have to work through, where if you bring this up, if Byron and Marc bring this up, they dismiss us. And then as we get a little frustrated about bringing this up and being dismissed, they move on to that second D, they discredit us. And after they dismiss us and they discredit us, they move on to that third D, because we're really kind of getting amped up and saying, no, but we're dying here. Literally, you're choking us to death in the street. They move on to that third D, they demonize us. And then once they demonize us, they can move on to that fourth and inevitable D, because once they demonize you, they're in check with their so-called Christian selves. They can move on to that fourth and inevitable D, destroy you. And that's the matrix that we've been in as Black people in this country, those 4 Ds, dismiss and discredit, demonize and destroy. And I thought, well, how do we come out of this matrix and really address the real issues? Because with that's everything is a distraction. You're killing us. You're incarcerating us. Everything is about don't focus on the money. And so I said, okay.
So let's talk about the money a little bit in the time we have, because that's an important point here. Let's get into the nuts and bolts a little bit of McDonald's, because it's a fascinating case that you laid out. They have an actual section for black advertising, which is different than the mainstream pool. And then they put a very little bit amount of money into the Black pool. But then on top of that, you own the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel is not a Black network. Yet when they advertise with you, or I'm just using it as an example, you don't get put into the big pool. You're still put into the Black pool, even if the thing you're selling is universal, mainstream, race neutral, whatever. So ultimately, you get penalized effectively for being Black. Am I fairly assessing what's happening?
Absolutely. And so you have that white water fountain and that colored water fountain, and it's separate but not equal. And what I said is, you know, and what I say to Black America is that we have to get a calculator and hold folks accountable. And what I said to McDonald's is that you have approximately 39,000 stores. You take in over 100 billion a year. A lot of that money is coming from African Americans, well into the double digits in terms of consumption and what we spend at your stores. And out of $1 billion plus in advertising, $1.6 billion or so, Black-owned media, what's left of Black-owned media gets less than $5 million of that. That's what we stated in our lawsuit.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, Chris Kempczynski, who is the chairman and CEO of McDonald's, his personal compensation is close to $11 million a year, more than double what all of Black-owned media takes in combined. And what Coretta Scott King taught me, she said, Byron, the greatest weapon we have is the truth. And I have never forgotten that. So all I've done by filing now $50 billion in lawsuits against corporate America is I've used it as a way to get around the 4Ds, because you just can't dismiss it or discredit it or demonize it because I'm using your process. And through litigation, I'm able to bring out all the contracts, and I'm able to bring out all the emails, and I'm able to depose people, and we can talk about the numbers, and we can talk about this disparity, this lack of economic inclusion. And what I say to America is, you have to understand something. As it relates to Black America, you kill us in the schoolroom by making sure we don't get a proper education. And you kill us in the boardroom by making sure we don't have real economic inclusion. And you kill us in the courtroom by making sure we don't have equal justice long before you choke us to death or shoot us in the streets. That's really where the genocide is occurring. And what you're starting to see are the byproducts of us being taken out in the schoolroom, in the boardroom, and in the courtroom. And this is where I've decided to lean in. And I've said, look, we have to make sure that we achieve the 4 E's, that every American has access to an excellent education. Every American has access to economic inclusion. Every American has access to equal justice, and every American has access to a safe environment. And when we achieve the 4 E's, we can achieve that dream, that vision that Martin Luther King had for us, which was one America. And when we achieve one America, we can actually have a slice of heaven right here on earth. And that's what we're doing. And we have to understand, as Black people, what's really happening here is we are the victims of economic genocide. And when you look at what's happening, that's why you're watching so many of us die at an early age, not live up to our fullest potential, because it is by design. It is by design. And when Coretta Scott King said to me, the truth of it is our most powerful weapon, I said, we have to explain this to everybody involved, and that's everybody watching, and also white America. And what I've said is, we have to understand how deep this racism is in America and how ugly it is. It's so deep and it's so ugly that, there was a book that was written in 1916 called The Passage of the Great Race. 1916, written by a young white man named Madison Grant. Well-to-do, lived in upstate New York, went to law school, and he was upset. He was upset about the immigration in New York. And when he walked around New York, he was upset about all of the Europeans coming into New York, the Jews, the Italians, and he writes this book, The Passage of the Great Race, Keep America White and Pure. This book becomes a big hit. It takes off and it changes immigration laws, so forth and so on. And this young man read this book and he said, this is the greatest book I have ever read. As a matter of fact, this book is my Bible. That young man was Adolf Hitler. So not only did we create this racism and perfect it and export it all the way to Europe, it came back as the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, Adolf Hitler gave an interview to the New York Times, and he said, I really don't understand why America's coming down on me so heavy. Everything I learned about immigration control, I learned from America. As a matter of fact, I thought America was going to become my partner. Think about that. Adolf Hitler thought America was going to become his part. And he also said, if you think about it, Adolf Hitler sent his Nazi lawyers to America and said, study the Jim Crow laws that they're using on the Negroes and come back and use those same laws on the Jews. That's how deep and ugly our racism is. And it is hardwired.
Deep and ugly is the
Americans.
exact way we have to describe this, because it is deep, it is ugly, and it's why we have to continue to fight racism and anti-Semitism. And with regard to your project right now in the United States, it's why we absolutely have to fight for economic justice and realize that racism isn't just an individual act of violence or disrespect or prejudice. It's about the systemic stuff. And Byron, we applaud you for the work you're doing. Thank you so much for spending some time with me tonight on Black News Tonight, and best of luck with the lawsuit. Everybody, make sure you join the conversation. We want to hear from you. Just head over to our BNC Instagram and Twitter pages to let us know how you feel. Be sure to check out our website, also bnc.tv. Stay tuned, because we have more coming up on BNT. KANDI BURRUSS is dropping by. She's going to talk about what she's up to. Also, next, author and podcaster Coleman Hughes. He's going to join the show, and he's going to talk about why he opposes the idea of reparation. Black News Tonight, return.